Ladies and gentlemen, dear members, it's a great pleasure to have you in this webinar, the last one in our series, The Old China Hands Bookshelf. This is book number 7 we're going to talk about, and I'm very privileged that I have my friend David Rennie here with me. He's going to be your moderator. He's the Economist columnist, very famous for its column Changwan. And I'm really very happy to have Professor Ang in the US. So for you, it's 9 p.m. So thank you very much for sacrificing your evening for us. It's going to be an interesting book. I came across this book when I was reading David's June Changwan, where he talks about falling off a horse. I guess he's going to explain that in a minute. And I knew Professor Ang from a previous book, which I really liked, How China Escaped the Poverty Trap, which came out a couple of years ago. And of course, she has been covered in the South China Morning Post, so she was a familiar name. So I'm very happy to have you live here. It's going to be about an interesting topic, corruption and the impact that has. So without further ado, I pass on to David.
Thank you very much, and hello everyone watching. So this is a great chance to finally meet Professor Ang in person. I've read your book before I'd met you, but it was a really fantastic book. I thoroughly recommend everyone reading the whole book. It's a great read, and it answers, or it addresses, and I think goes a long way to answering a real puzzle about China, which is that China is still, for all the efforts to stamp out corruption, it is still a country where there is a tremendous amount of corruption and a tremendous amount of public anger about corruption. And I think there's no doubt that the anti-corruption campaign is very popular with the general public. And Professor Ang, I think it's fair to say, and I invite you to kind of go into this, the brilliant thing about your book is you make clear that corruption at this level, the assumption, the conventional wisdom is that this is a major political crisis that should undermine support for the top leadership. And it's also the conventional wisdom is that this level of corruption should be a brake on economic growth. And yet you address at the very beginning of the book this paradox. And I'll ask you to take those to turn. Basically, this very corrupt country, actually, it hasn't completely undermined public support for the top leadership. So the political crisis turns out to be much more nuanced than we had thought. And it also has not been an obstacle to this extraordinary growth story that all of you out there, this is the bread and butter of your jobs, is we're here because this country has had 40 years of extraordinary growth, which has coexisted with a level of corruption which is supposed to be a brake on this growth. And I think the brilliant thing about your book, Professor Ang, is that you break down different forms of corruption, and you break down the different ways that the politics of corruption are perceived by the general public and by the elite leadership, and particularly Xi Jinping, who has made the corruption fight his great campaign. And so it's that ability you have to break it down and to analyze it and unbundle it that I think is the real power of this book. And so in that spirit, I'm going to unbundle my questions and broadly ask you about the economic paradox. How do they grow when they're still so corrupt? And then we'll look at the political paradox. Why is this level of corruption not devastating for the leadership? And yet, the way that the general public perceives it is different in some ways. You make this clear from the way that the leadership sees it. So let's begin with the economics. Why do you believe that it is too crude when development economists or the OECD or Western governments say corruption is bad in Africa, corruption is bad in Southeast Asia, corruption is bad in China, and will always be a brake on growth? And you make the case, I think, that we need to be much more subtle and to unbundle different forms of corruption to understand why China has escaped the seeming paradox. So let me ask you, first of all, to explain to the audience out there, what is your key argument about how you unbundle different forms of corruption that explains why the economy has not been destroyed by graft?
Well, first of all, thank you very much to the European Chamber for having me, Mr. Woodker and Mr. David Rennie. I'm a big fan of David's column. Every time I read The Economist, the first section that I turn to is the Chaguan column. So I was absolutely thrilled to see his review of my book. I'm very honored, and thank you for your kind words and for having me. You've started the discussion in exactly the right place, which is the conventional wisdom that corruption always impedes growth and why we should question that conventional wisdom. So let me kind of walk everyone through a few steps. Well, first of all, I think most of us would agree that it seems that corruption is always bad for growth. And that is a very intuitive impression because if you look at all of the rich countries in the world, including in the US, in Western Europe, rich countries have very little corruption. And if you look at the poor countries in the world, they have a lot of corruption. And that's what the global measures of corruption tell us. So when you just look at the correlation, it gives you the impression that corruption is always bad for growth. And in my book, I argue that this is actually an oversimplification and a misunderstanding because, in fact, even rich countries have corruption. It's just that that form of corruption has become legalized and institutionalized and transactional. And so it's not being captured in common understandings of corruption. And so if you look properly at the history of Western development, and that's why the book is called China's Gilded Age, if you think about America's development when it was a developing country, America, in fact, had a lot of corruption at its period of rapid economic growth. So there are certain types of corruption that actually is not bad for growth, but it produces other kinds of harm, such as inequality, policy distortions, and misallocation of capital. Right? So all corruption is harmful, and I wanted to stress that because it's very easy to fall into the opposite misimpression that I'm saying corruption is good. No, all corruption is bad, but there is one particular kind of corruption called access money, which is transactional exchange of power and wealth between elites. That form of corruption can actually stimulate growth and even overinvestment. That's exactly what we see in China today. It's also what we saw in America during the Gilded Age when it was a developing country. So when we understand that this is the form of corruption that prevails in China, we'll have a better understanding of two features of the Chinese economy. First, it is a high growth economy, but second, it is also a highly risky and imbalanced economy.
I'd love to pick you up on that phrase, access money, because one of the things I thought was maybe because I'm a columnist, so I always think in terms of sort of analogies, but you came up with this kind of sort of medical, pharmaceutical analogy for the four different types of corruption that you unbundle. So I wonder if you could explain for our readers who have not yet read your book, but are of course going to, that you have four types of corruption, four varieties. You have petty theft, so like a traffic policeman shaking you down on the roadside. You have grand theft, so a dictator stealing the gold from the central bank. You have speed money, which is a shopkeeper paying for a permit, otherwise he will never get his shop open. And then you have what you call access money, which, as I think you've hinted, is kind of analogous in some ways to lobbying and campaign contributions in a legal setting in places like America. So you have petty theft, grand theft, speed money, and access money. And you assigned, and I thought this was so clever, a sort of pharmaceutical analogy to why these are bad for economies in different ways. Could you explain that for the audience? So it was a really good way of making it clear.
Sure. I myself love analogies to help clarify things for myself. So I compared corruption to drugs. And I think that's a good analogy because we know that all corruption is bad and all drugs are bad, right? All drugs have side effects, but the side effects are different. So the way to think about corruption, the four types of corruption that David has described is when you think about petty theft and grand theft, these two types of corruption, I compare them to toxic drugs. You know, think about like cocaine, for example, or one colleague said it's like drinking bleach, where it has to be harmful, it is toxic, and you don't get any benefits out of it. That's what happens with corruption involving theft, where all of the money is stolen, it only benefits the corrupt official. And then you have speed money, which is petty bribes that you pay to low-level officials to overcome barriers and delays that otherwise wouldn't exist if not for the fact that they're trying to extract petty bribes from you. And I call speed money painkillers, right? So you're popping a painkiller in order to reduce the pain and the inconvenience and annoyance, but it doesn't actually do anything good for your health, right? It doesn't help you to grow faster. And then access money, I compare them to steroids, anabolic steroids specifically. And we know that this kind of drug helps you to grow big muscles, but it comes with a lot of serious side effects over time. And if we look at access money, we can further divide them into two varieties. The variety of access money in China still mostly takes the form of illegal massive bribery, because China is still a newcomer on the evolutionary path in capitalism. Whereas if you look at an advanced capitalist economy like the US, access money has become legalized and institutionalized. So by thinking about these four types of drugs, it helps us to understand different types of corruption and the different kinds of harmful side effects that they bring about.
And so, as you can see from my astonishingly muscular physique, I'm not a great expert in steroids, but just to kind of take the metaphor to its final kind of stage, if you accept, I think it's a great analogy, that steroids kind of promote this kind of distorted, unequal, lopsided growth. When you look at the Chinese modern economy, how does that translate into lopsided growth? This access money, the way that tycoons and entrepreneurs and senior officials interact, where do you see that distorting the economy when you look at modern China?
So first, let's sort of break down how access money can actually stimulate growth. And simply put, it's good for both the politicians and the capitalists. For the politicians, by having the availability of access money, they are more than willing to embrace capitalism because they benefit from it. So they're more than willing to push for development projects and to attract investments and so forth. So Chinese politicians are really distinguished by their feverish embrace of growth. And I have many anecdotes to share. One of the anecdotes that I had in the book was a slogan in a county leadership where they described growth promotion in religious terms, right? And they say that anyone who stalls growth is a sinner, and anyone who is able to bring in growth is a hero to our locality. So that's what it does for politicians, right? It really co-opts and brings them into the game of capitalism. As for the capitalists, if you are connected or are able to cultivate those connections, then together with the politician, you build, you invest, you borrow, you construct, you do business. So all of that actually stimulates growth and investment. But it has a lot of harmful side effects. One of it is grotesque inequality, not only between connected and non-connected companies, but within society as well. You also have overinvestment, because when you have crony capitalism, you have hotspots. You have certain sectors that are particularly vulnerable to policy manipulation, like land and real estate, where you can flip a piece of parcel of land and just make profits overnight. And so that indirectly has contributed to many of the most serious economic problems we see in China today, including mounting local government debts, overinvestment, And you see all of those problems very well illustrated in the case of Chongqing, where Bo Xilai was the party secretary in 2012. Tremendous, impressive economic boom, but he also left behind a huge mountain of debts.
That's fascinating, and I'm glad you used the Bo Xilai example, because that leads us in sort of neatly into the political part of this, because clearly he's now languishing in presumably a more comfortable prison than some, but less comfortable than others. So Bo Xilai is the classic example of, I think, a kind of salutary lesson to all of us, right? You know, we all travel around China for work, and we see these gleaming skyscrapers and these fantastic modern cities, and we take this as a kind of marker of growth. And I think you make the point in your book that it's not just that the real estate sector is a way to flip land to make money for crony capitalists. It's also favored because it's a good way of cashing out if you're a corrupt official. It's the handy way to cash out. So that's the distorting steroid kind of, you know, muscle man effects. Let's look at the politics of this, because Bo Xilai is the perfect example of someone who, in the circle around Xi Jinping, is the classic kind of case study of wickedness, the dangers of high-level corruption, which, and you quote Xi Jinping's speech just after becoming party leader, where he said that corruption was utterly destructive politically and shocks people to the core. So the idea that the party could lose its legitimacy if it does not get this in hand. And it's clear that corruption day to day makes the Chinese public very angry. You see this every time there's a corrupt official who uses their power to leave a road accident or is seen with a Rolex on their wrist or whatever. But here's the political paradox. We've discussed the economic paradox. The political paradox is that if you go to Chongqing, Bo Xilai is still really popular. So you have this guy who was as wicked as you could possibly be, stole a lot of money, was involved in, his wife was accused of murder, in fact, killing a British person, which is even worse, obviously. Yet he's really popular, and people miss him because the city grew and gleamed and looked a lot better when he left than when he didn't. So let's get into that political paradox, that at the same time, it seems that Xi is right, that corruption is a threat to the legitimacy of the Communist Party, and yet individual corrupt officials are sometimes enormously popular, and when they are taken down, the locals miss them. So help us understand that political paradox.
You put it very well, and I think I would explain it this way: that when we are trying to understand the Chinese public's perception of corruption, it is useful to distinguish between their perception of corruption at the national regime level, so their overall evaluation of the CCP, versus their perception of the particular local official in their hometown, who is doing the actual growth promotion, investment work alongside graft, right? So these are two very different perceptions. At the regime level, corruption was definitely a serious political crisis for the CCP, particularly when Xi Jinping took office. He took office under extraordinary circumstances, if we can remember. In 2012, he took office in the midst of Bo Xilai's scandal, which was the biggest scandal the party had ever faced. And for Xi, the significance of that event goes beyond this single scandal. What it really symbolized for him is that he had inherited China's Gilded Age. He had inherited the country at a time when it had high growth, but severe inequality and severe crony capitalism. And that is why his two signature domestic policies, one is anti-corruption, because he knew that crony capitalism had really gotten out of hand, and two is poverty eradication, because he knew that the overall inequality in the country has reached a truly crisis level. And so he's really built his reputation and legacy. You can almost call him a populist in the sense that he wants to present himself as fighting the greedy, corrupt officials, being for the people, eradicating poverty, and so forth. So that's what happened at the national regime level. But at the local level, people have a different perception because their relationship to the local official is something that is concrete. It's not abstract. And it's really about you as the local party secretary, what have you done for us? Have you brought about GDP growth? Have you brought investments? Have you brought factories? Have you helped us build roads? And at the same time, have you been corrupt? And I think at that micro local level is where you have this paradox that David described, where there are many Chinese officials who are simultaneously corrupt and competent. And I think the Chinese public perceives that. And in fact, I recently reviewed an article. It was anonymous, so I don't know who the authors are yet, but I thought it was a very good paper. It measured public perception, and it actually showed that the Chinese public would rather have corrupt and competent officials than to have non-corrupt and incompetent officials. And so I think that's that's a very defining feature of the Chinese political economy.
Do you think there's also a fascinating, really interesting that you talk about Xi Jinping as a kind of populist, because I do think there's definitely a kind of populist side to him. One of the fascinating things about being here this year during the kind of COVID lockdown, like many of us here, I haven't left this whole year. As I keep telling every Bao every time I meet them, I haven't left China, even though I'm a foreigner, so don't be frightened of me. But if you think of the incidents that have made the Chinese public angry this year that involved corruption, perceptions of corruption, what's been so interesting, I think, is that when you see the official party takedown of a big tiger, and there's this kind of corruption theater where you have the CCTV expose and they show you a sort of cupboard full of banknotes and gold bars and the kind of the Maybach parked outside, and then they always have 100 mistresses, which strikes me as an unrealistic number for any middle-aged man, but anyway, they have 100 mistresses, whatever. And the Chinese public kind of shrugs a bit, and it's like, eh. But remember earlier this year when someone left Wuhan who was infected with COVID and made it to an expensive housing compound around the corner from here in Beijing, that ordinary Beijingers were absolutely furious. How could they get through all of those checkpoints? They must know someone, they must have political connections. And that made people absolutely furious because in their own lives, Beijingers were locked down, they couldn't go out, it was tremendously inconvenient, they were frightened of this virus. And so the idea that someone would use their political connections to break the rules in a way that was totally impossible for ordinary Beijingers, that kind of social inequality, that kind of exposure of the total power gap, it seems to me that time and again, that is what enrages the public. Or when someone gets their kid into a top university by breaking the rules and jumps the queue or steals someone's Gaokao score, that makes people so much angrier than stolen money or stolen gold bars. How does that play in, do you think, to your perceptions of the idea, if Xi Jinping hopes that we're wanting virtuous officials, that doesn't seem to resonate in the same way, does it? It's much more, as you say, about this very cynical view of officials. But what drives people crazy is social inequality. Do you think that's right? Is that how the public at least perceives corruption?
I think that you gave a great example of the public being very angry at the special privileges that government officials enjoy. They were particularly angry about it in the context of COVID, as you described, like, I have all these restrictions, but you don't. This is clearly unfair. They're also angry when they read about the opulent wealth that these greedy officials have amassed, compared to the financial difficulties that they're facing in their lives, except when they are actually looking at particular leaders that they know in their locality, where they see this person in his whole complexity, kind of go both good and bad, corrupt and competent, then you get a very different perception from the public. And there are a few very representative individuals of this paradoxical variety. The one that I described, Bo Xilai is one of them. He was very popular in Chongqing, despite being vilified and despite being obviously a ruthless politician. Another was Ji Jianye in Jiangsu, and even the local newspapers, and I'm talking about a fairly liberal one, praised him as the man who has made the biggest difference to Yangzhou since 1949. So people recognize his contributions and they see the difference he has made, and then they look at his graph and sort of put that in context. So it really depends on the public perception of corruption is not a homogenous thing. It's very contextual, and it's sort of based on who that particular individual is in what context. But one of the interesting things I wanted to point out is that I think what Xi Jinping has been pushing for, or his ideal or aspiration, is that he would wish all of the local officials to be non-corrupt and highly competent. So that's his ideal type. And you actually see that ideal type being played out in the anti-corruption drama series. Remember, at one point there was this very famous series called In the Name of the People about anti-corruption, and the most loved character in that drama series is a party secretary who was highly competent, risk-taking, bold, decisive, and strictly non-corrupt. Right? So that's sort of the ideal type that he wants to push. But in reality, what we find is that all of these competent and risk-taking politicians, many of them are also corrupt. And these two things go together, because I argue that actually you have to think about a graph in China as something almost like campaign finance in the American system. These local officials actually need corporate sponsors in order to sponsor not only their own lifestyles, but also a lot of their development projects. And even Bo Xilai had his own corporate sponsors.
And just chip in on the name of Bo Xilai. I knew him since the 90s when he was mayor in Dalian, and he was is equally popular in Dalian as he is when you are in a taxi in Chongqing. And sometimes it helps that your successors are not very competent, then all of a sudden your star's shining even more. I have one thing, that personal experience, what the anti-corruption campaign can do to the decision-making in China, personal experience, and I would like to have your opinion on this one. Again, talking about Chongqing, my company has a huge investment there based on gas, and then 2.5 years ago, Beijing decided to go clean air, blue sky. They ripped out all the coal-fired boilers around Beijing and Hebei in particular, and then basically they had laid the pipelines for gas. But in the midst of that, they forgot to tell Sinopec and PetroChina to get more gas. So winter came, it was getting cold, as you remember, and all of a sudden 4 provinces were told not to supply gas to chemical processes, fertilizers, and so forth. So there we were. And of course, it's not very nice if you have to call up your head office and say that $1 billion investment is going to be mothballed for 3 months because no gas. So we came over, CEO, and we met a wonderful former minister who unfortunately passed away recently. And we asked him, how come that there was such a policy screw up? And he said, well, it's the corruption campaign. And we said, how is that possible? No gas in Chongqing, corruption campaign. He says, well, the corruption campaign has basically made it unattractive for people, in particular in economic ministries, to work in the middle management. So they're looking for jobs outside. You have the fourth plenum that was also not very helpful because people got told, officials got told that they were held responsible for the rest of their life for actions. So he said the corruption campaign basically leads to the fact the best people leave the economic ministries and are substituted by people that are not really that competent. And as he put it, third-rated policymakers don't make first-class policies. So there you are. A corruption campaign basically knocked down the chemical industry in 3 provinces for about 3 months. that seems to be something also in other ministries. If you think about the auto decision from China 5 to China 6, which was premature, just to look nice, that China gets more environmental friendly and so forth. So the experience I have is also that actually the corruption campaign led to indecision or actually replacement of great officials that might have had a shady side, but were extremely competent.
That's a tremendously instructive example that you just gave, and it really echoed with one part of the book where I talked about the anti-corruption campaign, and one of the unintended consequence is exactly what you described. And in Chinese, the term is lazy governance, 懒政. And it was serious enough that the state council publicly warned against it. They used certain individuals as, case studies of do not be like this person. And so it was a clear indication that this was not just an isolated incident, but it has become a systemic issue in the ways that you have described. And in a separate paper, I talked about how I think this indirectly subsequently played a role in COVID-19 as well. When the outbreak came, it happened to coincide with a bureaucracy that was already being super cautious, didn't want to make trouble. And so you just had this a very unfortunate combination of events coming together. But indeed, one of the unintended consequences of the anti-corruption campaign is swinging in the other extreme, which is if the conditions are such that it's better for me to do nothing, then officials would rather not take any risk.
May I just open up for the members in order to prepare questions? We have two people with us today. One is invisible and is stuck in Pennsylvania. Rachel, she's our chief censor. She gets all your questions and basically will then read the questions out when she thinks that you came up with a good idea. And then I'm very happy to have Francine here. She's our general manager for the South China chapter, which includes two offices, Shenzhen and in Guangzhou. She's here today in Beijing, so I'm happy she's here. Maybe you have a question?
Yes, actually, thank you for having me today. Going back to what you just said, it's true that it was the inaction due to the anti-corruption campaign was really felt by companies across all China. We had the same situation for different level of bureaus and officials. Decisions were not taken. So, however, you described the type of corruption, which is the access money, with pro and cons. It allows the economy to grow despite corruption. People are competent but corrupted, and it's very much accepted to a certain point. So all in all, is it a system which is desirable?
Is that the question? Is it a system that is desirable? Yeah, so yes. So that's
the same with or without steroids. So does it worth taking the steroids? That's a question.
Yeah. Well, to me, I wouldn't. If I knew the side effects of steroids, I wouldn't take it. And that is why I'm glad you asked me, because I think when we get to the question of is it desirable, it is a normative question. And so it comes down to our values. Do you want rapid growth at what price? Right? And China paid a price for its rapid growth. This is not growth without social costs. Right? It came at the cost of inequality, of crony capitalism, and all of these peaked in 2012. And China is not alone in having this steroids-driven type of growth. We saw that in America in the 19th century. We also saw that in East Asia before the Asian financial crisis. Right? So this is actually a kind of repeated story of capitalism, that you want feverish growth, yeah, you get capitalists and politicians together with this access money. So if you had asked me about the normative implications of the book, I think it also gets us to think about our own societies, our own capitalist free market societies, and to ask ourselves, how do we fix capitalism today? There have been a lot of people talking about fixing Western capitalism. We know inequality is a problem. And I think when we look at China, it helps us to reflect on the problems that we have today, which ultimately are still being caused by a more advanced variety of access money, right? So that would be the normative answer to the question of whether this is desirable.
Yes, dear members, again, chip in the questions. I have one for David as well as for you, Professor Ang. As David mentioned in his chart one in June, that 1.5 million individuals have been disciplined for graft, and people talk about 100,000 plus top officials who have been taken out on various levels. And a friend, who I guess is now online with us, once told me that each of these individuals that has been disciplined or put into prison has about 100 people that genuinely care about them, relatives and friends and former colleagues. That would make it, if you just say 100,000, a cool 10 million that had a genuine anger towards this government here. That might actually drive the government into the defensive. So what is the two of you thinking about the fact that the corruption campaign, in particular among the elite, has caused a situation where now the guys who unleash the corruption campaign are frankly more driven than they drive the campaign?
Well, I'll go first simply because I want to mention something that Professor Ang describes in the book that I think we should bring out, which is this comparison with the Gilded Age, you know, the kind of the robber baron capitalism period at the turn of the 19th and 20th century in America, when you were building the railroads across the American continent, and you had Tammany Hall and these, you know, tremendous growth. And in America, that then generated fantastic investigative journalism. You had these great expose books about the meatpacking industry. You had a tremendous growth in kind of civic activism. You had a tremendous kind of shake-up of the whole political party system, and that level of accountability and civic activism clearly is stalled here in China. And to pick up Francine's word of desirability, is this desirable? Professor Ang, I'd like to ask you, is it sustainable? Because it seems to me that one of the ironies of this anti-corruption campaign that we see right now, as your points to, is the incredible costs within the machine, the fear and the anger and the loathing within the machine. Is this in some ways an inevitable product of Xi Jinping era, where instead of that American response of an explosion of civic activism and investigative journalism, at the very moment that he is trying to rein in corruption, he is also closing down China's best newspapers, China's best investigative journalists, locking up lawyers who want to use the Chinese constitution to try and have some kind of checks and balances. So if you have a centralized system that eliminates checks and balances and yet leaves trillion-dollar assets in the hands of badly paid officials, and there are no external checks and balances, then aren't you kind of condemned to harsher and harsher internal purges and centralization, which leads to the kind of paralysis that we see? Because he's trying to fix America's Gilded Age without America's civic, democratic, and journalistic response. And so to pick up Francine's question about desirability, I'd like to throw the word sustainability to you, Professor Ang. Do you think that President Xi can dictate virtue from the center, as he is attempting to do, without external checks and balances and accountability?
I love the phrase that you use, that Xi is trying to fix America's Gilded Age without the democratic tools of the Gilded Age. I think that really synthesizes the story very well. I guess a way I would rephrase these comments is, has China entered the progressive era? Has China entered the American equivalent of the progressive era? And for those who were not aware of this, the progressive era was the period following the Gilded Age, which was a time of cleaning up corruption. You had administrative reforms, political reforms that basically brought about a much cleaner and more transparent government in the United States. Also broke up monopolies and so forth. So it was a very formative period in American history. And I think in my book, I left that ambivalent for exactly the reason that David described. Because on the one hand, I think it's very clear that Xi inherited a Gilded Age and he was very determined to fix the excesses of the Gilded Age. But on the other hand, he actually went the opposite of the democratic way of fixing these problems. He has his preferred method is top-down and coercive. And so his crackdown on graft, while being welcomed by much of the public, has at the same time had some very serious backlash. And I think the way I would characterize Xi's sort of attempts in the past few years to deal with the excesses of crony capitalism is that he wants to have all of the good things, and he doesn't want to pay a price for any of them. He's been trying to do that. So he wants to have a state-dominant economy, but at the same time, he doesn't want to deal with the fact that when you have a state-dominant economy, you're going to encourage corruption. He wants to have competent officials, but he wants them to be highly virtuous. So he wants to have an ideal world, and he's not been willing to make the necessary compromises for making at least some part of it work, which is what Deng Xiaoping did. Deng Xiaoping is a very pragmatic leader, and he's like, if we open up markets, we're going to have flies come in, and I'm willing to live with that. But Xi's approach is, I would like to have, all of the ideal outcomes that I want, and if it doesn't work out, I will dictate virtue. And I think for the past few years, he's been trying to dictate virtue. This actually has some parallels in Chinese history. A lot of people would draw parallels between Xi and the Ming Dynasty, where the founding emperor was famously strict on corruption and had his whole life wished that he could dictate virtue on all of the officials in China, which in the end did not work out, of course.
Maybe I bring in Rachel. She's in the US right now and looking at the questions. So Rachel, I understand you have questions lined up, so please go ahead.
Yes, quite a few questions coming in. Thanks. The first question from Julian Buckeridge at NGS Global. Can you compare corruption in India and China, and if the difference is reflected in economic performance?
That is a great question. I'm really glad you asked, because I actually did compare corruption in India and China in one part of the book. And this was actually a global corruption measure that I created myself because I was frustrated with the bias and limitations of the existing measures. And in this survey, what I basically do is to compare the structures of corruption in different countries between China and various other developing countries. So the comparison between India and China was particularly interesting to me, because these two countries are perceived as equally corrupt when you look at global indices like Corruption Perception Index, right? These two countries are ranked exactly the same. But if you actually break down the type of corruption that prevails in these two countries, India is dominated by speed money. So a lot of the corruption in India is concentrated on paying small bribes to get over regulatory hurdles, whereas in China, the corruption is concentrated in access money. So I'm paying to buy privileges, but not because I'm being, hindered by a million petty bureaucrats. And this actually has to do with the difference in regime type. And I quote Professor Bodhan in my book. He said in India, this official in Delhi said, if you want me to speed up a file, I cannot do that. But if you want me to stop it, I can do that immediately. Right? So that is the political dynamics in India. Being a fragmented democracy, it's about the power of the official lies in his veto power. In China, it is the total opposite, as you know. Power is concentrated in individual leaders, right? So you're buying their power to open doors and give privileges and deals that no one else could. And so that is why when you compare these two developing countries, both perceived as more or less corrupt, the structure of corruption is actually completely different.
Thanks. The next question comes from Chao Jingzhou at Deschert. The anti-corruption campaign is being perceived as a power struggle for redistribution of power, but is also defined as, quote, having slim pigs replacing the fat pigs. Without a check and balance and without a social and media supervisions, are there any positive outcomes of the anti-corruption campaign?
Thank you for the question. Are there any positive outcomes? Well, I would say that, to be fair, we should give credit to the fact that the leadership takes this problem very seriously and wants to fight crony capitalism. And to put things in context, this problem of crony capitalism had really festered in the decade before Xi, and that was a leadership that was sort of close, they closed an eye to these problems, but at the same time, they were much more loose in their control, right? So there was pros and cons in the previous leadership. And so when Xi came along, he said, I'm going to do whatever it takes to fight crony capitalism. So I think on the level of political will, that deserves some credit. And it definitely, if you talk about positive outcomes, officials today are so much more cautious about graft, but at the same time about doing anything wrong as well. And so that is why it's sort of, it's a campaign with both some positive effects in terms of, forcing officials to be on their toes, but it also has a lot of negative effects, like the ones that we have just discussed, causing paralysis in the bureaucracy. And you also use the word power struggle, and I think one of the most commonly asked questions about the campaign is it just a power struggle? And I think the fair answer is that, of course, there will be elements of power struggle involved in it, but it's not just a power struggle. And you actually do see that in my statistical analysis itself, it serves multiple purposes. There is a genuine intent to fix the problems, but absolutely, along the process, could it be used for power struggle? It could be. And so it's a mixed picture with both negatives and positives.
And Professor Ang, would you agree that there's a kind of, if we're looking at the normative damage that corruption does, there is a distinction between unblushing, blatant corruption, where you have a regime that says, yes, I'm stealing everything, yes, my son is driving a gold-plated Ferrari, and what of it?
Yeah.
And that has a kind of corrosive effect on the whole of society's view of norms and values. And there is something different between that kind of blatant what of it corruption and kind of hypocritical corruption, where there's an anti-corruption campaign and you happen to notice that the immediate family of some of the most senior leaders still have an awful lot of money, which is not investigated. But at least it's not blatant. At least it's somewhat shamefaced. And that even if hypocrisy has its own costs, there's a difference in the normative damage between a hypocritical corruption and unblushing corruption. There is a distinction.
Absolutely. I think even long before the anti-corruption campaign, there has been a growing sense of sort of a kind of a moral, what would you call that? A moral crisis within Chinese society. that is most vividly seen among the actions of corrupt officials, but also just more broadly, the sense that capitalism has brought about a degradation of moral norms in China. I think after having this conversation with you, David, particularly the political paradox that you bring up, I think it's worth stressing that my sense is that when the Chinese leadership says we want to fight corruption, they don't make those subtle distinctions between the different types of corruption that you have just described. So they don't make the distinction between, the corruption of a local official who is competent and takes bribes at the same time versus certain officials who are corrupt and then send all of their money overseas. They haven't made that distinction. And instead, they sort of frame this whole thing as this is all corruption and we're going to get it.
Rachel, you have more questions?
Yes, the next question is from Peter Young at Enterprise Ireland. What do you see as the equivalent of the CCP's Commission for Discipline Inspection in Western countries, or is it a unique structure?
I think almost every, thank you for the question. I think almost every country has either an agency or section within a ministry that is in charge of anti-corruption. What is unique in China about the disciplinary apparatus is that it is not part of the administrative arm, but it's directly under the party. This essentially gives it a much higher political status because its job is to go after corrupt officials and senior party members. But anti-corruption apparatuses and agencies are by no means unique to China, of course.
As you mentioned China, let's briefly look at Hong Kong. I mean, Hong Kong had a very corrupt system, I think, into the 70s, and then had all of a sudden stop and basically said, I forgive you for past corruption. And whenever you do anything from this day onward, you're going to get penalized. Why didn't mainland China decide to go down this road?
Oh, I see. Of forgiving past.
Yes, yes, grandfathering.
Of grandfathering. I'm not sure why. I can't read their minds. But I think perhaps one of the reasons is that there are some very serious cases that can't be put aside. Bo Xilai being one of them. If you had grandfathered him, it's not clear that you can really start afresh with his case. So I'm not really sure why China did not go that route. But when you mention Hong Kong, there is one thing worth I think highlighting, which is that one of the reasons why corruption, access money, has not hurt China's economy is that, like Hong Kong, China over the years has done actually a remarkable job in sort of very technical administrative reforms that constrain petty corruption and embezzlement. And you actually see that in the patterns of corruption. So the kind of corruption that has exploded is bribery. But when you look at embezzlement, when you look at petty bribery, bureaucratic extortion, in all of those realms, the Chinese government has taken very strong methodical steps at containing them. The part that it hasn't been able to contain is corruption among the elites, because it's hard for the guardians to guard themselves.
As you're a Singaporean, is the Singaporean model something that can be replicated elsewhere, or is it just fitting a city and would not sort of fit into a model such as China being the size of a continent?
That's a very good question. And I think it really brings out, in the case of anti-corruption, the limitations of replicating the so-called Singapore model. One of the features of Singapore's anti-corruption is that civil servants are paid very well. as we know. But if you look at China, it is the opposite situation. The formal wages for civil servants and government officials are extremely low. They're below subsistence. If you look at the numbers in my book, it would be quite shocking. There is no way that these individuals could live a respectable life on their wages. And so in a sense, corruption is actually built into the system. You can't survive without having extra income. And this is actually an enduring feature of Chinese governance. If you look at the Qing dynasty, the Ming dynasty, going back thousands of years ago, it has always been this way. Government officials are only paid sort of a nominal fee, and then they're expected to finance themselves, right? So this is actually not new in Chinese political history, but in the modern capitalist context, right, the sources of income have exponentially grown and complexified in a global capitalist economy. China can't replicate the Singapore model. It tried several times to raise formal civil service wages, but the price of that is just too staggering for China. It's just practically impossible. And also because China has huge heterogeneity and diversity. So it's very hard to set, a fixed template for the whole country. As we know, China really operates like a continent with multiple independent regional economies.
Can I just add, it's hard for me to be objective about the importance of a free press, but I do think in answer to that very good question, in Western countries, there's plenty of very bad journalism in Western countries, but it's also the case that having a free press that can then expose things and then lawyers get involved is unbelievably important. And I think one of the dangers of what's happening in China at the moment is not only have we seen over the last decade, papers like Nanfang Zhoumo, the Beijing Qingnian Bao, which used to do, good investigative journalism, or the constraints now put on Caijing, or even some of the reporting that Caixin has done over the COVID, which has been fantastic. We're now seeing tremendous pressure put on the doctors who spoke to Caixin, whatever, from Wuhan. You're also seeing, and again, I'm not objective here, the foreign press. We've had 16 American reporters expelled this year from China, including, the Wall Street Journal is down from 14 to 4, the New York Times is down from 12 to 1 in country. The Washington Post is down to 1, soon to 0. We think there's going to be more expulsions. China used to understand, although it didn't admit it very often, that the foreign press played a useful role. That sometimes our reporting was annoying, but it actually brought things to the attention of the leadership. I remember Zhu Rongji in 2001 actually explicitly saying at a press conference that the fact that the foreign press had disbelieved the official version of events around a terrible scandal involving children who were killed making fireworks in their own classrooms in a school, that the fact that the foreign press did not believe the official explanation led him to send investigators to see what had happened at that school. And he said this in the NPC final press conference. That would never happen now. So we're about to enter a period where China tries to do this without the New York Times, without the Wall Street Journal, without the Hong Kong free press, without freedom of speech in Hong Kong, with muzzled lawyers here in Beijing and increasingly in Hong Kong. So I think things are going to get even more dangerous because the last few checks and balances are being removed.
Yeah, I could not agree more with you. I think journalists, investigative journalists have, despite their constraints, done a lot for Chinese governance and policy making. Many of the major policy changes made in China were as a response to exposés made by journalists. And so the recent developments are definitely worrying. And I think it goes back to your point, David, about sustainability. Obviously, we are in an extraordinary situation, and there are many sort of moving parts and unpredictability. But I think on the whole, if we look at the past few years, it has been a shrinking of that liberal and creative energy that has really brought China from 1978 to the height of its Gilded Age. And no doubt, even at the height of its Gilded Age, it had plenty of social problems. It was by no means a perfect situation, but it had come a long way. And I think overall, if we look at the situation now, it is, we see, turning inward, we see restraints on civic freedoms, on journalism. We also see restraints being put even within the bureaucracy, right? And that we've already discussed in the context of the anti-corruption campaign. So I think this is a kind of worrying development, and we will have to continue to see what will happen after 2020. But if this continues, it does not, in my opinion, lay a healthy governing foundation for China's continued development.
Professor, my father-in-law was 14 years Russian ambassador here, so I'm very close to the interface of Russia and China, and you can see how very often President Xi is referring to Russia, first of all, to the ultimate sin that Khrushchev committed by criticizing Stalin in 1956. Then, of course, the breakup between their most important partners, Soviet Union and China in 1962, which left China technologically stranded, very similar to a situation we have now with the US. Then, of course, the reference always to perestroika and glasnost, the era where he has clearly said late 2012 that Gorbachev was undoing communist system. At the end, no one was standing anymore. But the fourth dimension of his Xi's obsession nearly with Soviet Union or Russia is the Yeltsin period, when you could see that the nationalization of, the privatization of SOEs in Russia led to huge fiefdoms, the Berezovskys, Khodorkovskys and the likes, that actually, I think, led Xi to believe that he really has to rely on SOEs. He cannot privatize a couple of those companies, and he has to keep a check on Chinese private enterprises, so once they get rich, they don't involve into politics. So what is your take on this one, that actually, by being afraid that a strong private Chinese enterprises might corrupt decision-making by frankly just having so much money and so much influence, and sometimes, like Jack Ma, incredible media exposure, that this kind of fear of this kind of corruption leads to stifling the most innovative part of the Chinese economy?
Yeah, and I'm really glad you brought up the comparison with Russia and the former Soviet Union, which is always China's point of comparison. And I think the remarks that you just gave sort of reminded me of an argument that I often make, not specifically in this book, but my other essays, is I think both Western observers and the current Chinese leadership sometimes commits the error of false binaries, meaning they think that the option is either democracy or autocracy, either top down or bottom up, either privatization or big state-owned enterprises. But if we look at China's reform history from 1978 to 2012, China is most vibrant and innovative when it is pragmatic. And when it's pragmatic, the best Chinese institutions are always hybrids, right? So it would be like, it's a single party political system, yes, but it has democratic characteristics put into it. Yes, it has some elements of central planning, but it is for the most part a capitalist economy. And the Chinese along this way created all kinds of hybrids in enterprise forms, in property rights, in laws and regulations, so that they can navigate this very sort of new political and economic system that no one has ever created before. And I think once leaders fall back into this false binary that, oh, the American model is not good, and therefore I have to go, all the way back to the other extreme, then I think we end up in situations of extremes where people lose sight of what is the most pragmatically effective option. And I think reform China that 35-year history actually offers abundant lessons for the Chinese leadership today. I've always said that the country that most needs to learn from China is China. But they need to pick up the right lessons from that history. And I think that that history is sometimes misinterpreted as China rose because we had centralized control, because we had a so-called strong state, and we need to do more of this. But that's in fact a misinterpretation. The real story is that China rose because it was so remarkably pragmatic, and it would create any kind of hybrid that worked, as long as it worked for the situation.
Dear members, we are going into the last 10 minutes. There will be no overtime like in soccer. So chip in the questions now, and Rachel can then ask David and Professor Ang. Just 20 years ago, when the chamber was founded, the founding ambassador from the European Union was a great scholar, Endymion Wilkinson. You might know him. He was the grandfather of the European Chamber, and he gave a speech and said the system in China rests on two pillars. One is Manchester capitalism, and the other one is a Leninist party structure. So maybe that's the hybrid in 2 words. Maybe David has more questions for you or statements.
Yeah, I mean, Professor, do you think that this political experiment that Xi Jinping is trying to run of sort of centralized, dictated virtue, do you think that the model that he is taking, and I know it's always dangerous to start trying to psychoanalyze the big guy, but one of the things that's interesting is we've talked about a whole bunch of periods in Chinese history, but one of the things that I sometimes hear from Chinese academics, particularly liberal Chinese academics, is don't underestimate the psychological importance of the 1950s and this idea that there was a kind of virtuous early period of the Chinese Communist Party. That kind of, the kind of clean-limbed Boy Scout, no one had any money, so there was no corruption, kind of heroes of the Long March finally reached Beijing and took power. That kind of good Communist Party is in some ways something that almost by kind of genetic inheritance, that Xi Jinping, as you say, came into power at this moment of real crisis where the party had become corrupted to the kind of Bolshevik extent, and that Xi was kind of handed power by the elders with a mission to save the party from itself. And one of the kind of narratives that you do hear here is that his vision of virtue is very much drawing on this idea of a kind of a simple, patriotic, virtuous, early 1950s Communist Party. So I think that's one period that we haven't touched on. So just at the end, as we're starting to wrap up, tell me if you think there's anything to those arguments when people think that that might be something that really informs his worldview. And if it does inform their worldview, is it actually relevant? Is it applicable to the China of 2020? Can we have this kind of, the China of kind of Liu Shaoqi and all of these people? Does it have any relevance in 2020?
I think that there is real substance in what you have proposed, which is that I think to some level the Xi leadership might really try to put their faith in the possibility that through instruments of loyalty creation and that you can create this cadre of truly dedicated and honest and competent bureaucrats. And in fact, the inspiration comes not only from the 1950s. As I've said, I have colleagues who are Ming historians, and the Ming history is also very much focused on dictating virtues. So this has precedence in Chinese politics and governance. But I think that if they believe that, and they believe that they can rule by dictating virtue, that is probably not being very pragmatic, because the world has changed, the reality has changed. This is 2020. It's a global capitalist economy. And so the conditions of the 1950s where you have limited exposure to the free capitalist world, you have limited consumption goods. Those conditions no longer hold in 2020. In 2020, you see vast inequality. You see some tycoons having tremendously luxurious lifestyle, which makes officials wonder, given all of my power and my work and my contributions, why am I so much more impoverished than them? So I think, to be practical, the conditions today are vastly different from the 1950s, and the leaders should be pragmatic enough and wise enough to recognize that. And perhaps I could conclude by sharing an anecdote. I once met a propagandist. So this is a central propagandist. He is almost every 5 minutes, he would repeat a party slogan. He always tell you, this is the right thing to do. The party is always right. The party tells us these policies. We should always listen and so forth. So he is as hardcore as it can get in terms of having the right political ideas and minds. And then when you actually get to dinner, you discover that this propagandist is an expert in drinking baijiu. He knows everything about alcohol and drinking games, right? And so you kind of have to question, like, I wonder, with your political purity and ideological purity, how did you get, knowledge of this aspect of life? Right, and so that is the reality. I'm not surprised to see that, but I think the leaders should be pragmatic and wise enough to see that this is the reality. This is a very different world from the communist age of the 1950s or from the Ming Dynasty, and the right thing to do is to set up the right environment for officials to be competent, to do their jobs well, and then to really think about what are the right ways to compensate them without causing the kind of very, very distortive consequences that we have seen in the past 30 years due to access money.
Maybe the last questions from my side before you wrap up to David. Last week, a spectacular action took place in the outskirts of Beijing where villas were demolished. Of course, well-to-do people in a very lush environment. Was that really because they broke environmental laws of building houses there, or was that sort of an opening shot for a certain strata in the society to say, I'm going to look into this kind of corruption, watch out?
Yeah, and also, do the people around Xi have something in their bonnet about villas now because of the Shanxi kind of villa scandal? I think that's absolutely right. I think that there is a lot of fear, and I'm sure we all find this. You go to dinners with elite Chinese at the moment, and people are frightened because they're talking about how their friends got money out and stuff. One last thing, though, given that this is the European Chamber, that occurs to me is if, to any extent, the 1950s or the Ming Dynasty is the model, and if we have this very inward-looking internal party discipline structure that is trying to impose virtue, dictate virtue, without external checks and balances, what room does that leave for the foreign investors who are such an important part of the story in the Zhuroji era? Because if everything is being done by the party committee, if all faith is being placed in SOEs because the private sector is scary, if that is the model, then, and if you're throwing out the foreign journalists who might report on what your business partner is actually up to, what's the room for foreign investors? An interesting question for another day maybe is there such a thing as a Chinese multinational private company? Does that exist? Can it exist? When the leaders of China's largest companies are clearly answerable to a whole bunch of other power structures and other incentives to do with, internal party discipline. And I wonder this drive to eradicate the poison you've set out so brilliantly. This is going to mean fewer dynamic entrepreneurial sort of mayors building gleaming cities. But are we also going to see a crisis for foreign businesses here? Because they're no longer sure that they're interacting with a familiar form of capitalism.
Well, that's very interesting because I asked David a question and he comes back with 5 questions for me. And I think the kind of wording from him is, and the idea is so interesting that we might actually turn that into a conference topic. So thank you very much, David, for doing this. I have to wrap up, dear friends and members. I'm very happy that the 7th edition of our bookshelf turned out to be such a sparkling show. I really would like to thank Professor Ang in the US and Michigan for doing this, and would like to also thank David for not being only a moderator but an inspiration for our next webinars. And then, of course, lots of people are engaged of getting this off the ground. It's Rachel again, who is our chief censor. Thank you very much for doing that. Laura in Shanghai was establishing this, Muya was helping us here. So we have a great team. We had a great audience. Francine came in from South China. And with that, I end our series. And as you just learned from David, I think we might develop a new cycle with new topics. Stay tuned. Thank you very much.